Dr. Ayfer Karakaya-Stump is our guest speaker from William and Mary College. She's an associate professor of history. She was born and raised in Istanbul, Turkey. She received her PhD in history and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard University. Before taking up her position at William and Mary, she was a postdoctoral fellow for 2 years at Cornell's University Society for the Humanities. In the 2013-14 academic year, she held a Mellon Fellowship at the American Research Institute in Turkey and a senior fellowship at the Koç University Center for Anatolian Civilizations. Her scholarly interests include medieval and early modern Middle East, social and cultural history of the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Safavid borderlands, Sufism, nonconformist religious movements, Alevi-Bektashis communities, and women and gender in Islamic or Islamicate societies. Her monograph, Kızılbaş Alevis in Ottoman Anatolia, Sufism, Politics, and Community, appeared in 2019 with Edinburgh University Press, and it's based largely on newly discovered sources from private archives. She's also the author of a Turkish language monograph, Alevi-Bektashis, Kızılbaşlık, Alevi Taharini, I cannot say the rest of them too quickly. So that appeared at Bilgi University Press in 2015. In addition to her academic work, Karakaya-Stump also published commentaries in periodicals and newspapers and given interviews on current Turkish politics. And I'm Melinda McClymans. I'm the Assistant Director of the Middle East Studies Center. And my focus is on pedagogy and learning and Middle East curriculum. And I am an OSU alum, and I've led study tours for teachers in Turkey several times, and I facilitate online conversations with Turkish students. So I connect our students with Turkish students in classes and facilitate different cross-cultural exchanges online. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Karakaya-Stump. So I think you'll be able to share your screen at will, but if you have any issues, let me know.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you, Melinda, for the introduction. It's wonderful to be to return to my alma mater, even if only virtually, and be part of a panel with one of my first mentors in the field of Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Alan Payund. So it's really a great pleasure. Let me share my screen first. It's not going to work the first time I try, but it will probably work the second time. Or maybe, let's see. Let's see. Yeah, I need to stop share and then I'll share again and then it will work. You can see my PowerPoint, right? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yeah, so as Melinda said, I'm actually a historian of late medieval and early modern periods, but I also think and occasionally publish op-eds about contemporary Turkish politics, and sectarianism, structural discrimination, and systemic police violence are among the issues that I am particularly interested in. And my talk today will draw heavily on an earlier op-ed that I published entitled Alevizing Gezi. All right, so let's start. In this country, recently, George Floyd's chilling murder and heartbreaking final words, "I can't breathe," has reminded us more forcefully than ever before the prevalence and dire consequences of structural racism and systemic police abuse against African Americans. Police brutality or excessive use of force by the police is not a problem limited to this country, of course. It is actually a common worldwide problem that deserves greater attention by everybody. Use of excessive force by the law enforcement is a potential threat to everybody, regardless of one's ethnic, religious, class background or gender identity. However, it's also true that instances of police brutality committed against historically oppressed and marginalized groups far exceeds the average numbers in any given society. In my talk today, I'll focus on this phenomenon of systemic police brutality against minorities in the context of Turkey. I will specifically be talking about the Alevi community and their treatment by the police and the government officials during the Gezi protests in 2013. There are, of course, many differences between the American and the Turkish context. Most importantly, as I will explain shortly, the Alevis are not a racial, but a sectarian or religious minority. Having said that, sectarianism in Turkey and the Middle East at large, for that matter, fulfills the same function as racism in this country in terms of sociocultural hierarchies and power relations. In other words, what white supremacy does and represents in the US, Sunni Muslim supremacy does and represents more or less the same thing in Turkey. In terms of differences between the two cases, I should also mention that the Gezi protests, unlike the Black Lives Matter movement, started not as a protest against treatment of a minority by the authorities, but simply as a protest against the government's decision to demolish one of the last remaining parks at the center of Istanbul and build a shopping mall in its place. And as you all know, these protests quickly turned into a nationwide anti-government protest movement. Notwithstanding these differences, there are actually strong parallels between the way Black people are brutalized by the police in the US and the way minorities and dissidents are treated in Turkey, the Gezi protests being one of the most dramatic examples. In both cases, when you explore the events closely, you see how police brutality and repression operate selectively and discriminatorily. Both cases show us how law enforcement calibrate the scale of violence according to their target and how in their interventions they can and they do exhibit restraint or brutal force depending on time and place. But the adjustments the police make to the scale of violence they exercise according to circumstances is often so minute and subtle that it can be hard to demonstrate the kind of structural discrimination that we are discussing today. And I'll go back to this issue at the end of my talk, but first I want to speak a little bit about the Alevis and who they are. Then I will give some background about the Gezi protests and Alevis' participation in these protests. Finally, I'll show how all these tie in to our broader concern here, namely systemic police abuse against minorities. The Alevis are a little-known ethno-religious community who, together with the kindred Bektashi order, make up around 15% of the population of Turkey, with smaller pockets of related groups, especially in the Balkans. Here's a map of their distribution, but this map is actually more reflective of really the 20th century, because since then, most of the Alevis have migrated to big cosmopolitan cities or to Western countries. But still, it's useful to give you an idea. The Alevis are sometimes, but mistakenly, referred to as Turkish Shia, even in some scholarly works, despite the fact that they do not self-identify as Shia, not to mention that there are among them also significant numbers of Kurdish and Zazaki speakers. However, the Alevis do share in common with the Shiites certain things, including, most importantly, a veneration of Ali, the first Shi'i Imam, and his 11 successors. They are, however, clearly set apart from the Shi'is by the heavy doses of mysticism that mark their belief system, which bears a close affinity with Sufism and a number of pre-Islamic mystical traditions. Alevis typically do not perform formal Islamic obligations, such as daily prayers and fasting during the month of Ramadan. Their distinct liturgy, Ayn-i Cem, is attended by both men and women, where poetry by mystical dervish poets is recited and the ritual dance of Sema is performed. Guardians of Islamic normativity, that's mainly the jurists or the ulama, both Sunni and Shi'i, traditionally count the Alevis among the so-called Gulat sects. Gulat, literally meaning exaggerators, is a category that was created originally by medieval Muslim heresiographers, but also adopted by modern scholars through a very problematic translation as, quote, extremist Shiites. The Gulat have been placed beyond the pale of Islam for their, quote, excesses, unquote, arising from their abrogation of Sharia and their conception of the divine as immanent and all-encompassing and as permeating all creation, which is interpreted as polytheism by their critics. This monistic ontology complements and informs other more specific Alevi beliefs, such as the idea of human beings as the locus of divinity, the immortality of souls, and the possibility of their transmigration from one body to another, and the kindred notion of cyclical existence, devir, all of which run contrary to Islam's normative precepts. Alevis also reject an afterlife as depicted within Sharia-bound mainstream Islam and basically understand hell and heaven as metaphors for the relative spiritual condition of the soul. In the past, Alevis practiced their religion in secret due to fears of harassment by their Sunni neighbors and the state authorities who view them with suspicion because of their religious and political nonconformism. They began migrating from their villages into big cities in the 1950s, but Alevism continued to be a taboo subject in Turkey until the Alevi cultural revival of the late 1980s and early 90s, which got underway with a flurry of popular publications, followed by dozens of Alevi cultural and religious associations sprouting up in cities in Turkey and Europe. Parallel to these developments, more and more people were able to publicly disclose their Alevi identities, which they earlier feared doing due to fear of stigmatization and retaliation. The 1990s also marked the start of the Alevi struggle for equal citizenship. However, concrete gains were very modest and very slow to come. It took a legal battle of several years for Alevis to just gain the right to utilize the term Alevi in the names of their organizations. Despite all that, the Alevi movement has relied on strictly peaceful and legal means. Here, for instance, are two pictures from a huge Alevi rally in Kadıköy in Istanbul that took place in November 2013. This was one of the largest rallies in the entire history of the country of Turkey. And in the second picture, you have an Alevi woman in traditional dress, and she's holding up her bağlama, which is considered a sacred instrument by the Alevis. Needless to say, when AKP came to power in 2001, Alevis were not thrilled, and they never really believed in the sincerity of AKP's democratic turn, not only because of the party's Islamist background, but also because Tayyip Erdogan had already established a notably bad record with the Alevis due to his attempt as mayor of Istanbul to bulldoze down one of the few remaining Alevi sacred sites in Istanbul, the Shrine of Karacaahmet. The AKP government indeed confirmed Alevi suspicions through their reluctance to apply the type of democratic notions that they championed for conservative Sunni Muslims when it came to responding to Alevi's demands for legal recognition and religious rights. And these demands are very modest, very commonsensical demands, and I can talk about them in greater detail at the end of the talk if there are any questions, but they are really as simple as the legal recognition of Alevi's houses of worship, cemevis, and the ending of mandatory religion classes at schools, so on and so forth. Of course, Alevi's disenfranchisement has historical roots much older than the AKP. They faced waves of persecution during Ottoman times, and in most cases could only survive as close communities in relatively remote rural parts of Anatolia and the Balkans. Despite their staunch support of Mustafa Kemal's secularizing reforms, discrimination against the Alevis did not cease under the Republic either, which, although formally secular, continued to promote Sunni Hanafi Islam as normative through the well-funded Ministry of Religious Affairs. With limited exceptions, Alevis have continued to be denied positions of high authority and have remained on the state's watch list due to their strong leftist leanings and ethnically Kurdish segments. Dozens of Alevis have been victims of mob violence perpetuated by right-wing militants, often with the tacit consent of security forces in the 1970s, and as recently as in 1993, 33 artists and intellectuals attending an Alevi cultural festival in the central Anatolian town of Sivas were killed when a mob surrounded and burned down the hotel they were staying in. The Alevis, due to their affinity with leftist politics, were also among those who suffered the most under the military regime following the 1980 coup that promoted the culturally conservative ideology known as the Turkish Islamic synthesis. The same military junta institutionalized the mandatory religious classes at schools that the AKP is enthusiastically embracing and further expanding today. But AKP's policies towards the Alevis are not limited to their embracing and maintaining past injustices. Alevis' grievances, in fact, have multiplied and intensified, especially since 2011. This turn for the worse for the Alevis paralleled the growing self-confidence and authoritarianism of Tayyip Erdogan and his government since the constitutional referendum at the end of 2010, which brought about an increase, which brought about an increase in the power of the executive branch of the government at the expense of judiciary and the parliament. It's well known that AKP's authoritarian streak was further reinforced during and after the Gezi protests. This is pretty well known that the Gezi protest was a turning point in that sense. What is less known is that concurrent with this authoritarian turn, the divisive sectarian rhetoric of Tayyip Erdogan and the AKP government also reached to levels unprecedented in Turkish politics before. I will explain shortly the connection between Gezi and the growing sectarian rhetoric of the AKP government. But first, a little bit about Gezi. Gezi protests erupted in May 2013. Gezi is the name of a relatively small park in Taksim Square in Istanbul, which is really the last green refuge at the center of the city, which has turned into a concrete jungle over the years. When the government decided to demolish the park to build a shopping mall in its place, a group of environmentalists started a sit-in at the park to guard the trees. But the violent eviction by the police of the peaceful sit-in at the Gezi Park triggered a wave of mass anti-government protests nationwide. Over the next few months, 3.5 million people flocked into the streets in 5,000 separate demonstrations in 77 different provinces of the country. The epicenter of the protests was Taksim, where the Gezi Park is located. But there were also solidarity rallies in other parts of Istanbul, as well as in other parts of the country. Police used tear gas and water cannons to suppress the protests, and 6 people were killed, or depending on how you count them, 8 people were killed, and thousands were injured as a direct result of excessive use of violence by the police. Gezi was an urban protest movement that developed spontaneously, assembling a diverse group of sociocultural milieus in contemporary Turkey. It brought together groups ranging from environmentalists to secularists, from protesters against the hydroelectric power plants to LGBTQ individuals, from Alevis to anti-capitalist Muslims, from socialists to liberals, from Kurds to Armenians, from educated middle classes to blue-collar workers on the urban peripheries. What unified them was the government's, was their opposition to the government's neoliberal economic policies and utter disregard for the environment and urban citizens' rights. Policies that aimed at top-down Islamization of the society, as well as Erdogan's increasing authoritarianism in general. Now, what did Tayyip Erdogan and the AKP government do when confronted with such massive protest movement against their administration and various policies? Not surprisingly, rather than addressing the grievances of the people, Tayyip Erdogan tried to delegitimize the Gezi protests, and he tried to do so by associating these protests with the Alevis, or as I say in my aforementioned op-ed, by Alevizing Gezi. He resorted, in other words, to the sectarian card, as it were, in an effort to mobilize his conservative Sunni constituency against the Gezi protesters by insinuating in his speeches that Gezi was an essentially Alevi uprising, even though Gezi lacked any sectarian themes or goals whatsoever. So how did the AKP government do that if factually it is entirely inappropriate to call Gezi an Alevi uprising? They did so through a group of journalists who function as Erdogan's proxies in the media. These journalists tried to forge an organic link between the Gezi protests and the Alevi community, calling the Gezi protests as an Alevi uprising. And they based their claim on the fact that all 6 victims of the Gezi were of Alevi background. All 6 youngsters who were killed during the Gezi protests were of Alevi background. They also made references to a police report that somehow got leaked or released, I don't know, according to which 78% of those detained during the Gezi protests were also Alevi. Of course, this report in and of itself is very problematic because it operates as a confession of religious profiling on the part of the security forces, because officially in Turkey, they don't count people of different sectarian identities. They count the Alevis as regular Muslims. So the fact that the police had a report like this, suggests a religious profiling, an illegal religious profiling, but I will leave that issue aside for now and simply assume the accuracy of the report in question. Now, what I problematized in my aforementioned op-ed entitled Alevizing Gezi was the simple quantitative logic that these journalists used based on these 2 figures to project a picture about the broader demographics and the nature of the Gezi movement. Needless to say, coming from pro-government journalists, these are clearly, I realize that these were clearly far from being innocent observations or analytical meditations. They were clearly intended to incite agitation against the Gezi protesters in the eyes of AKP's electoral base among the conservative Sunni Turks. However, what was interesting was that even liberal or left-leaning journalists, academics, and intellectuals who were sympathetic towards Gezi operated with the same superficial quantitative logic. In other words, they too saw these numbers, the fact that 6 out of 6 of those victimized by the police during the Gezi protests were of Alevi background, and that 78% of those detained were also of Alevi background. They saw these numbers as simply as a manifestation of widespread Alevi participation in these protests. Of course, in contrast to the pro-government circles, they read these numbers not as a reflection of a sectarian conspiracy, but rather as an understandable consequence or reflection of the long-standing grievances Alevis had suffered in Turkey, and especially under the AKP government. So even though the interpretation was different, both sides nonetheless took these numbers at face value. Of course, it's not wrong that Alevis were among the sectors of the Turkish community that were represented in large numbers in the Gezi protests. But even though it's not wrong, I think this line of analysis is incomplete and rather superficial because it relies on the naive assumption that, quote, nobody is marked with the word Alevi on their forehead, unquote. This is actually a phrase that we use in Turkish. So basically the assumption was, these were Alevis, and obviously it's a reflection of widespread Alevi participation in these protests because, there's no way for the police to tell apart who is a Sunni and who is an Alevi. And in my op-ed, I sort of problematized this data and digged a little deeper to get a more satisfactory answer to the question of why all those who fell victim to police violence during Gezi protests and the overwhelming majority of those taken under custody in conjunction with Gezi protests were Alevi. So I don't sort of agree, I did not agree with the statement, nobody's marked with the word Alevi on their foreheads, and I sort of dig deeper to get a more satisfactory answer to this question. And the answer that I came up with had to do with structural sectarianism and systemic police brutality. Let me explain what I mean with that. When we look at the particular places where the Gezi victims were killed by the law enforcement, we see a pattern. First of all of these victims were killed outside the epicenters of the protests, which included Taksim, Beşiktaş, and Kadıköy. And these murders, the killings, happened instead either in Istanbul's peripheral districts, inhabited heavily by Alevis and leftists, or during solidarity rallies in other cities of Turkey. More specifically, 2 of the 6 who died in direct relation to the Gezi protests, here I'll show you their pictures. So 2 of the 6 who died in direct relation to the Gezi protests, Abdullah Cömert and Ahmet Atakan, faced police brutality and lost their lives in Armutlu, one of the 2 well-known Alevi neighborhoods in the Hatay province, while Mehmet Aybalıtaş was killed in the May 1st district of Ümraniye, Istanbul, and Berkin Elvan in the district of Ok Meydanı. Both of these neighborhoods are known for the Alevi leftist identities of their inhabitants. Ali İsmail Korkmaz lost his life in Eskişehir, and Ethem Sarısülük in Ankara's Güven Park. All these neighborhoods that I mentioned are not only urban spaces characterized by the Alevi leftist identities of their inhabitants, they're also sites of organized resistance in the face of an ever-expanding sphere of urban renewal plans by the city government. Thus, they have been sites of frequent protests and other forms of organized resistance and subsequent police interventions, not only during, but also well before the Gezi protests. Even though rarely covered in domestic media and the general public remains largely unaware of it, the inhabitants of these neighborhoods have long been living under an unofficial state of exception, and the police forces know them intimately and vice versa. Thus, I believe it was not a sheer coincidence that there were no deaths reported in Istanbul neighborhoods such as Taksim, Beşiktaş, and Kadıköy. These are middle upper class neighborhoods where we witnessed the longest lasting protests with the highest number of participants. And that all youths killed not only had their Alevi identities in common, but also shared similar class backgrounds and political dispositions. What this picture points out is rather how the police calibrates the scale of its violence according to its targets, and how in its interventions it could exhibit restraint or brutal force depending on time and place. The scale of violence is also tied to its visibility, of course. Indeed, after the third day of the Gezi protests in Taksim's Gezi Park and following the stationing of international media around the square, the scale of violence exercised by the police in and around Taksim was relatively decreased, while that unleashed on protesters outside of Istanbul, including Ankara, increased dramatically. This shows once again how the law enforcement is very capable of making minute adjustments to the scale of violence it exercises according to circumstances. The same insights apply to the data shared by security forces, alleging that 78% of those taken under custody during the protests were Alevis. If we assume that there is an elective affinity between the profiles of those killed and those taken under custody, exactly where these individuals were taken under custody emerges as a critically important question, as there is little doubt that the police are more prone to resort to such methods of repression and control in the aforementioned profiled neighborhoods. Even outside of these particular neighborhoods, police violence can be selective and malleable depending on the protesters' clothing styles, symbols worn and carried, body language, and where and with which political formations they claim their rank in a protest. These markers by themselves or in combination can oftentimes be very revelatory of the protesters' cultural and political backgrounds. Overall then, the details of the Gezi protests point out the importance and necessity of going beyond mere numbers and surface appearances to really understand the workings of systemic police violence and repression against minorities. I think this is also an important lesson for people in this country who have been reckoning with structural racism and systemic police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. Thank you very much.